Let's bring in CBC senior business correspondent Peter Armstrong. Hey, Peter.
Hi, Ian.
Give us a little perspective on these rates.
Because it requires some perspective, right? Like, this is a lot to digest, especially when you think about just how long we were at such rock bottom rates. But, you just look at the numbers here. Go back to March of 2022. The bank's rate then was at 0.25%. And since then, we've now seen, 10 hikes, some of them by a full percentage point each. This is, Ian, the fastest, most aggressive cycle of interest rate hikes this country's ever seen. And today, that brings the bank's rate up to 5%. So, as you say, it requires some perspective, it requires some digestion, not just trying to figure out your accounts and what this is going to mean for your bills, but just getting your head around such a sharp increase over such a short period of time.
And a lot of people watching feel that it requires some explanation, too. Why is this happening?
Look, it's a good question, and it does take a bit of a step back, because there's something kind of counterintuitive about this. What the Bank of Canada is doing, and indeed central banks around the world are doing the same thing, of walking something of a tightrope here, trying to use interest rates to slow the economy, right? As those rates rise, households, the me's and the you's of the world, we get squeezed by our higher borrowing costs, and so we buy less stuff. If we buy less stuff, prices should come down. That's the theory. But the flip side of that is every single time those rates go up, you're injecting a little bit more pain into the economy. And from a central bank's perspective, you don't want to slow things so much that you cause an outright recession, or you take a potential downturn and make that longer and more damaging than it absolutely has to be to get inflation back to target.
One of the things I find really interesting is, even though you follow all of this really closely, you were surprised.
I was, and that in spite of the fact that literally every economist in the country was saying the bank was going to do this, but I had somehow convinced myself that the bank was going to pause. And, Ian, in my defense, the data sure look like they back me up on this. Remember, the Bank of Canada said that it needed to see progress on three key files. It wanted to see GDP cool down, it wanted job growth to moderate, and obviously it needed inflation itself to decelerate. But look, GDP is down from 3.8% last year to basically zero now. Jobs numbers came in a touch better than expected, but certainly not the kind of blockbuster growth that we saw over the last year. And then just look at how far CPI has fallen, from 8 to 7 to 5, now 3.4%. And Ian, we're going to get the latest inflation data next week, and the expectation is that it will cool even further to 3.1%, really then knocking on the door of the target window the bank has. And, not to get too deep in the weeds here, but it generally takes like 18 months for interest rate increases to really work their way into the economy. So I thought the bank would take that time and maybe hike in September if it needed to, but wait and see how this is all playing out.
Okay, we'll talk about September in a sec, but I'm curious, what impact is this going to have?
It's going to have a huge impact, and that impact is going to be everywhere. When we think about these changes, one of the first things we think about are people who hold a variable rate mortgage. But look, fixed rate borrowers are coming due too. 2/3 of mortgage holders in this country, and still haven't renewed at these new higher rates. So it's going to hit them. It's going to hit renters as landlords jack up their rents, at least in part because they say they have to keep up with their own debt payments. And that's not just households, though it's a huge problem for them. I spoke with a bunch of small businesses over the last week or so, people who are getting clobbered on their rents. And remember, small businesses make up like 70% of private sector employment in this country. So it really does matter.
And so, Peter, what comes next?
Well, now we're going to get to what the data really tell us, right? Because if the argument here is that these rates are going to help bring down growth, then we need to see that start to show up in the data. So we're going to look for GDP data. We're going to look at the jobs data. We're going to get the CPI data, as I said, next week. And we'll get to see, is the economy really running too hot? And, we're going to be back here talking about rates again in September, because the bank left the door open to another rate hike. It said we don't necessarily think the economy is going to slip into a recession, that it's going to hover right around 0%, which is where it is now. But if they sense in that data that we get over the next 5-6 weeks that it's not doing enough, it said it's going to do what it has to do to get that growth back down and to get inflation back under control. And right now, at this moment, Ian, the market swaps are showing that like an 83% chance that the bank will hike again this fall. So there's a lot of moving parts here, and we're just going to have to try to keep track of them as they come in.
Okay, Peter, always nice talking to you.
You bet.